Welcome to Macro Hive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. We aim to bring you the best macro analysis to help you successfully invest in financial markets. For our latest analysis, visit macrohive.com. One of the benefits of hosting this Macro Hive podcast show is that I get to regularly speak to exceptional people. And not only that, but the guests come from diverse fields. We've had investors, academics, policymakers, and even scientists. Now, specifically on the policymaker side, we've been fortunate to have top guests such as former Bank of England Governor Lord Mervyn King, former Reserve Bank of India Governor and Chief Economist of the IMF Raghu Rajan, and former Finance Minister and Central Bank Governor of Argentina, Alfonso Prat-Gay. And in this episode, we have Sajid Javid, who was previously Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK. Now, our ability to attract this caliber of guests goes to the heart of the philosophy of Macro Hive. We aim to think and collaborate in a networked way, just like a hive, and we try to be as open as possible. And that's the best way to be on the forefront of changes that will impact markets and economies. And others see this philosophy and then are attracted to be part of the hive. And our growing number of Macro Hive members attest to this. Members get to receive all the market analysis from the Macro Hive team, as well as our carefully curated research partners. Members also get to access our special Slack chat room called Hive Minds, where we all talk markets and macro 24 hours a day. And I should add, it's much less toxic than Twitter. So I'd urge you, if you're not already a member, to sign up at macrohive.com. The first month is free, and then it's only the cost of a few weekly cappuccinos. It's well worth it, and many call Macro Hive the hidden gem for investors. So once again, visit macrohive.com. I'd also like to thank the sponsor of this episode, Moonfair. Moonfair believes exceptional investors deserve exceptional returns. Returns like those offered by carefully selected top-tier private equity funds, an asset class that has been for decades out of reach of most investors. Given the current volatility in stock markets, the specter of inflation, low yields on most classic fixed income products, and the advent of all manner of unproven asset classes, Moonfair believes private equity has a place in every portfolio. Fidelity International recently selected Moonfair as its exclusive distribution partner for private equity funds, a confirmation of Moonfair's obsession with picking the best fund managers and all types of private market funds, from venture to growth to buyout and infrastructure funds. Nearly 1,500 investors have trusted Moonfair so far with their money, and the company is hurtling towards 1 billion euros in assets under management. It recently launched a new and improved secondary market in partnership with Lexington, one of the largest private equity secondary fund managers in the world, giving investors the flexibility to exit their positions before a fund's holding period elapses. To get started, please visit moonfair.com/macrohive. That's moonfair.com/macrohive to create your free profile. It's completely free and without any obligation, and gives you access to Moonfair's platform where you can see which funds are available, check out due diligence documentation, and connect with Moonfair's investor solutions team. You can also check out Moonfair's library of white papers exploring different topics around private markets, investing, along with some of Moonfair's favorite episodes of the podcast. I've rummaged around the site and it's definitely worth it. So I'd urge you to check out their site, moonfair.com/macrohive. Now, onto this episode's guest, Sajid Javid. Sajid is currently the Conservative Member of Parliament for Bromsgrove. He's held 2 of the 4 great offices of state in the UK government, Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary. He was first elected to Parliament in 2010, and before that, he worked at Deutsche Bank and Chase Manhattan Bank. At Deutsche, he helped build their emerging market businesses. Sajid was born in Rochdale, Manchester, and was raised in Bristol. He read economics and politics at Exeter University. And for those of you who follow UK politics, you'll know that Sajid is a very principled and thoughtful politician. So I'm sure you will enjoy our conversation. Welcome, Sajid. It's great to have you on the podcast, and it's a great honor as well.
No, thank you very much for having me.
Great. Well, there's a lot going on in the world at the moment. And I think the first thing I wanted to ask you was obviously about the pandemic. I mean, how do you think the UK's handled the pandemic so far?
I think, Bilal, it's clearly been a very challenging situation for countries across the world. And I think particularly in Europe, unlike some of the East Asian countries where they've had SARS and other coronaviruses before, it really challenged all the pandemic plans countries had, including, of course, the UK. So sadly, of course, we've seen a high infection rate and a high death rate. compared to some other countries. But in some other ways, the economic response, I think, has been incredibly robust. And of course, the vaccination program really stands out in the UK. I think fair to say amongst the sort of large countries in the world, the furthest ahead in the vaccination program. And that doesn't happen by accident. And so definitely a challenging situation. There's definitely things, there will be lessons to learn in the future from this. And it's right that the Prime Minister has set out there will be a far-ranging, deep inquiry to make sure we do that. But if I may, just to expand on I know a lot of your listeners are particularly interested in the economics of all this. I think, look, once the government had decided that we are going to have, in the early days, these lockdowns and all these big social restrictions and activities, so it meant, naturally people can't consume the way they normally would, or producers can't produce. Of course, your economy is going to be hit. And then, so if you're sitting in the Treasury, I think my colleagues in the Treasury were sitting there thinking, look, how can we best protect the economy? Almost put it into some kind of hibernation so that when you come out of these restrictions, you're just better fit to grow the economy than otherwise. And I think that's what Rishi and the team did. And in my own view, I think they did an incredibly good job in terms of what they announced, those early actions. First of all, saying we'll spend what it takes. I think it sends a very important message and builds confidence. But then things like the tax deferrals, the sort of rebate programs, of course, the furlough scheme, the COVID loans, all of those designed to sort of keep this economy in a sort of hibernation stage. And so that as it thaws, as we now can see, we're starting to open up and release some of these restrictions. I think companies can get back to business a lot more quickly. Consumers have been protected as well, especially for the furlough program. And for that reason, I think we can see growth coming back a lot quicker than otherwise.
Yep. All kind of good points. I mean, one concern many people do have is about the fiscal picture. So, obviously there's been big fiscal deficits run in the UK as well as almost every single country in the world. I mean, how do you see the fiscal picture in the UK? And, for you, I mean, obviously, you've got a lot of experience in these areas. What are the things you're looking out for as the lockdown ends?
Look, of course, that's been challenging too. I mean, look, the first thing I'd say is that because the government for the last decade, really, ever since the financial crisis, but certainly the last decade, has worked hard to try and get public finances under control, the so-called, sort of austerity years of trying to be prudent with public finances. That did mean when we were entering this crisis that the government had more room for maneuver, more freedom fiscally than otherwise. And that clearly, that freedom, that flexibility has clearly helped. And of course, in responding to the crisis, with all this extra spending, and not just the sort of support programs for the economy, but of course, you're going to need extra spending, let's say for healthcare, for social care, in the education system, all of that, not to mention the welfare payments, that has meant the deficit, as you say, has ballooned. The debt to GDP has risen to levels that we haven't seen in decades, close to 100% of GDP at least. But if you look ahead now, for lots of reasons, I think the situation can be brought quickly back under control. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be running a deficit for a few years. I think realistically, the deficit will come down from the really high levels we find it at now, but I think it can be brought down quite substantially. And why do I think that? I mean, first of all, I think we are seeing already this year, but certainly by the end of this year, I think we would look back at an extraordinary level of growth. Yes, it's from a base that was very heavily impacted by a 10% decline in the previous year, but still that growth will lead to a sort of starting of the normalization process, an increase in receipts, tax receipts. But also, I think that growth will be supported by the stimulus that we've seen, the record of both fiscal monetary stimulus, not just at home, by the way. I think, for example, what the US is doing with their absolutely ginormous stimulus program is going to be helping countries across the world. And so that's to be welcomed in a way as well. So thank you, President Biden, for that. And then also in terms of the record amount of savings we have in homes. The other thing I'd point out, by the way, is that some commentators have sort of compared the economic impact of this to what you might see in a war or something. And I can understand that. Clearly, it's a huge amount of disruption. But there's one huge difference economically, which is that unlike a war, there's no physical destruction of capital. So the capital that's there, everything from the roads, the rails, the factories, it's still there. And as we open up, you'd think it can be brought back into production very, very quickly. And all of this, I think, means that you'll see a rapid improvement in the fiscal situation. Let's also be realistic that you're going to see longer term, I think, as a result of this, an increased need for public spending in certain areas like healthcare. think of all those non-COVID healthcare problems that have sadly built up over the last year, probably in education as well, social care, and maybe in some other areas. And that does mean that the government's going to have to work hard to make sure that revenue is there. We've already seen the Chancellor, and I understood this, that his last budget set out a modest increase in taxes, and certainly in corporation tax. But I think given the situation, it's justifiable. And the key thing with taxes is that, yes, there might be this modest increase, but if in the long term you're competitive, that's what matters.
Yep, that makes sense. I mean, the other thing aside from the fiscal picture is many people are starting to get worried about inflation. And inflation, I guess, in many ways hasn't really been a problem for people in office and government for a long time. But now it really does feel like something is going on. I mean, do you have a view on inflation?
Yes, no, I do. I am concerned. I'd put myself firmly in that camp because let's look at the facts. There's been a huge amount of liquidity in the international markets. Every major central bank you can name is engaging in money printing of one sort or another. And we've seen that already. Look at asset prices, particularly financial asset prices, as people, you try to put that money and you find a home for it. And not just financial assets. I mean, look at the housing market, not just in the UK, in the US, most of Europe. There's a lot of money around. Money's still cheap. That's got to have some kind of inflationary impact. The second thing is related more sort of directly, let's say, to the pandemic. You will have, I think, that this pandemic, where it's great that the vaccines are working and we're starting to go towards, let's call it a new normal. I don't think we're going to go back to the kind of world exactly like we had before. And in this new world, certainly to begin with, you'll see some kind of social distancing remain and an impact on supply chains and things, and all of that, I think, is going to have a bit of an inflationary impact. If restaurants can't seat the same number of people as before, or if airports can't have the same quick throughput as before onto the planes and off the planes, some of those prices they're gonna have to rise to reflect the increased costs and on supply chains. I would expect governments, whether it's the UK government or others, but particularly those in Europe and North America, to invest more in preparing for future pandemics. So that might mean lab capacity, PPE capacity, vaccination production facilities. And I don't think they'd want to rely on supply chains in quite the same way they did this time round. And that means shorter supply chains, which means less competition, which probably means a little bit extra cost. So I think those factors all play into inflation. And then if I may, very quickly, I think even before this pandemic came along, there were some what I would call like long-term structural reasons or structural factors that might lead to higher inflation than otherwise. And one of those is what many economists have called this like the big demographic dividend over the last 30 years, particularly from China as it's entered the global international trading system. And that sort of deflation almost that was exported by China is over. And so none of us will benefit from that going forward. And secondly, climate change. As the world rightly takes the threat of climate change more seriously, it might mean in the short term, as you take that externality, carbon, and you start charging for it in one way or another, that somewhere along the system, there's going to have to be some payment for that, and that might be inflation. So look, there's lots of reasons I've given that. I think my view is pretty clear that I think inflation is heading north. And I thought the other day, I heard some of the Bank of England's projections for this year, and I thought they were a little bit optimistic.
Yeah, no, fair point, yeah. And you mentioned climate change, and I know this is something that you have a keen interest on. I mean, what are your thoughts on climate change? I mean, obviously, there's all kinds of these international agreements we see, but how should the UK manage climate change?
You're right, but I'm very concerned. I've long been concerned about this. I think it's very real. I think it's a major threat to our livelihoods. And I'm pleased that the UK, for a number of years now, and to be fair, under successive governments, has been taking this seriously. So domestically, compared to 1990 levels, our emissions are down, I think, over some 41%, which is better than any other major economy. We've still got a lot more to do. And I was pleased to see Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, set out an even more ambitious set of targets for the next decade, which is what we need other countries to do. And then, often people will say, not just with respect to climate change, but also something closely related, which is the loss of biodiversity, which I'm also very concerned about, that, isn't it going to cost, Sajid, if we invest in, whether it's in new infrastructure or in other ways to try and combat these threats? And yes, there might be some cost, especially in the short term. But what I also know is that the cost of delay is even higher, right? And for those people that say, look, what about our living standards today if we combat this? I can say actually with certainty that if you don't combat this, if you don't take action collectively across the world, then the impact on your living standards will be very significant if we leave climate change to take its course without us trying to stop the rise in the global temperature. So I think the kind of investments that the government's already announced, especially some of the capital investments, for example, how we travel, electrification, whether it's how we produce electricity, but also how we might charge electric vehicles in the future. I think all this kind of investment is welcome. The last thing I'd just say on this is that, clearly, because we all live in the same planet, we're one important country, but there's many others, and we need everyone to be taking action. And you asked me about how the UK is approaching this. I think it's also through international leadership. There was a big review of UK long-term foreign and security policy called the Integrated Review. It was published just a few weeks back. Years of work went into that. And I thought it's very telling that in that report, right at the start, it says that the UK's number one foreign policy goal is combating climate change and loss of biodiversity. That's our number one foreign policy goal. And I think we're already seeing how seriously the UK takes this on the international stage. Obviously, we have the COP26 coming up this year. We've also got something called the COP15 conference, which is on biodiversity in China later this year as well, where the UK, China is the lead country, but the UK is playing a leading part in that as well. And then, of course, through the G7, I think we'll see the UK continue to lead in this. And obviously, and in working with other countries, the two countries that are going to be absolutely critical to get a good working relationship on this is number one, the US, and with the change in administration there, I think that's very positive for tackling climate change, and also China, of course. And China is a country where we rightly have a huge number of issues with, particularly on human rights. But when it comes to the planet, I'm glad that there's still a dialogue and a positive dialogue, and that we're able to have these separate conversations. And
you mentioned the importance of climate change, and you mentioned the report that puts climate change at the top. I mean, when you speak to colleagues in the House of Commons on both sides of the aisle, I mean, is your sense that other people in Parliament have a similar view of the importance of climate change?
Yes, but I'd say the following, that I think it was in 2019, yes, when Theresa May was there, we had this historic vote in Parliament, which was the vote for net zero by 2050. And that was, as it sounds, putting into legislation the requirement that the UK must be net zero emitter by 2050. Now, that got almost unanimous support in Parliament. So every political party, every political leader supported it. And I think, top of my head, well over 90% of MPs voted for it. So it's hard to find anything else in Parliament that is so clear-cut in terms of Parliament's view. Now, that said, I would also say that, when it comes to making decisions that are this important, the easy bit is actually agreeing to do something 30 years from now, right? That's the easy bit, right? It's easy to agree to say, look, over the next 10, 20, 30, we're going to do X, right? The harder bit, of course, is how do you get there? And that requires lots of other decisions that will come to Parliament over the next 20 to 30 years. And Parliament is going to then have to make those decisions to make that net zero commitment a reality. So, and that's just my way of saying to you, yes, I think the commitment is there in Parliament, but I think if we're frank, the easy bit for now has been presented to Parliament. The harder, heavy lifting is yet to come.
Yeah, no, understood. And speaking about heavy lifting, we've obviously, UK is now living in the post-Brexit world. The UK's left the EU. I mean, how do you see, the UK's global role in kind of a post-Brexit world?
I'm really excited about it because, look, first of all, actually, I start by saying this, is that when we had that Brexit debate, a few years ago now, some of your listeners might remember, there were almost like two versions of Brexit on offer, right? Yeah, obviously, a lot about the Remain camp, but in terms of even the Brexit world, as it were, there was this sort of, let's call it the Farageist view, which was about a Britain, probably that never existed, but let's go back to a Britain where we can pull the drawbridge up and not have much immigration and be inward looking and insular and isolationist. That was the sort of Farage view. The other view, which I would call the sort of globalist, global Britain view, the open and welcoming view, was basically what Boris Johnson was talking about. He said, he was very clear that Brexit, it doesn't mean that Britain is stepping off the world stage. If anything, it is taking an even more strident steps on the world stage and standing up for its own the challenges of the world and playing its part. And the global Britain that he envisaged was open and welcoming, whether it's open and welcoming to investment, to talent, to skills. You look at some of the decisions, for example, on talent and skills that the government has made, with obviously Boris Johnson now as Prime Minister, where, we've said as a country, if you are a British national overseas passport holder in Hong Kong and you feel that you can't live there anymore because China has violated the treaty that it signed with the UK, then you are welcome to come to Britain. That's up to 4 million people in theory. And Britain is opening its arms to those people. It's the right thing to do morally, but I also think economically it can be great for Britain. We've also had global talent visas, for example, that are being issued and things like that. So yes, we've left the EU, but what I see is a Britain that's going to remain open and welcoming. I think that's great in many ways, not least for our prosperity. And also, I think partly what global Britain means is recognizing that as a country, the UK, you could perhaps say it's too small a country to be the sort of rule maker for the world, but it's also too big to be a rule taker. It's somewhere in the middle in terms of its size and influence. And that, I think, puts it into a pretty good place to be maybe a broker, an international broker. It's not a member of the EU. It's not a member of any other sort of alliance that dictates its foreign policy. It's a country that can actually play this broker role, where given its history, its diplomatic reach, its interest in global affairs, its research capability, its language, lots of reasons where Britain can say, when it comes to the world's biggest problems, we talked about climate change, biodiversity, the dealing with this pandemic, global rules for trade, arms control, all these big issues. I think the UK is uniquely positioned to be the world's broker, to bring people together, to get them around the table as a multilateralist and say, listen, we've got a lot of problems in this world, but we're better off dealing with them together. And the UK, for all the reasons I said, I just think is in a unique position to help deal with them.
Yeah, do you think that the UK should form some kind of alliance with other sort of liberal democracies, like Japan, Canada, maybe even India, because in some ways you have this block of like US, you have the EU block, you have China as this kind of the three big blocks.
Yeah, it's something actually the Prime Minister has talked about. In fact, he first talked about it, if I remember correctly, when he was the Foreign Secretary. And I agree. And I think he's referred to various as maybe the D10, the D12, depending on how many countries. And you missed a bunch of countries which would all be legitimate candidates for that, and there are others. But basically, let's say an alliance of the world's leading democracies. And why? I think one of the key reasons would be is that in the world today, we are seeing, I think, sadly, an emergence more so of, let's say, a sort of closed world than an open world. The open world being the democracies, the key representative of the closed world being China. And it's really important that when it comes to human rights, when it comes to democracies and elections and representative government and freedom of speech, that the people that believe in that, their countries that represent those values, work together. And if anyone wants an example of that right here and now, just look at what we saw very recently over Belarus, where we saw a civilian airliner going between two NATO countries, forcibly stopped in effect and forced to land by military jets so that a authoritarian hardline dictatorship could remove a brave journalist that was speaking out the truth, right? And the democratic world cannot let that happen and go without a response. And there's been a response so far. It was notable the UK was the very first country to come out and ban flights over Belarusian airspace, to ban their national airline and possibly take more action. But the EU's now done the same. The US has done the same. So it's really important that these democracies, whether they are in Europe or whether it's our friends in India or the US, that we all work together. And so I do think there's a very strong case for that.
Yeah, we've talked about lots of kind of big and heavy topics. I mean, I just wanted to round off with a final question on a more sort of personal note. Obviously, in the UK, the lockdown restrictions are being eased up. Hopefully, come June, as we go into the summer, the restrictions will be almost completely lifted. I mean, what's some of the first things you plan to do, with the family after lockdown restrictions are lifted?
Oh, there's so much I would have wanted to do in the last year, but sadly couldn't. What would have one of the first? I'd love to take my mum on a nice holiday. Yeah, like I think like a lot of us, if your parents didn't live near you, we probably didn't get to see as much of them as we would have wanted, or our other elderly relatives. And it's been particularly hard, I think, on older people, as we know that the virus, sadly, has been particularly tough on them. But now that we've got vaccinations and things we're opening up, as travel opens up, I'd love to take my mum on a nice holiday somewhere. And I think the condition for her might be that if I take that, I don't just want to go out and eat. I did miss her parotas and samosas and things as well. So there might have to be some of those in the bargain as well.
Yeah, and that's a quid pro quo. Nice. Yeah. Okay, with that, that's excellent. I do always enjoy speaking to you because you're one of the kind of few people in kind of politics I find who, has really well-informed views on some of the big issues across multiple different domains. So it's been really fun chatting to you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, good stuff. And have a great rest of the year. And, hopefully you'll have a kind of happy and safe time after lockdown gets lifted.
Thank you. Good. And keep your excellent research coming.
Great. Thanks a lot, Saj. I'd like to thank Moonfair for sponsoring this episode. Moonfair is now launching its Moonfair Growth Equity Portfolio, a product to make private equity growth and tech funds easier than ever for individual investors to access. The days of buying the post-IPO pop are over. Private equity growth funds are claiming more and more of the value that comes from tech companies of all stripes. Since the early 2000s, the typical time to IPO has increased from 3 years to 10 years or more, according to a Carlyle Group analysis of research conducted by two Texas University professors of finance, Keith Brown and Ken Williams. Investors in these private companies, meanwhile, claim 80% of the value created, according to Brown and Wiles. Moonfair's growth equity portfolio allows investors to capture this value. Moonfair's portfolio of growth equity funds is available in some markets from minimums as low as $60,000. To get started, please visit moonfair.com/macrohive and create your free profile. It's completely free and without any obligations. And it will give you access to Moonfair's platform where you can see which funds are available, check out due diligence documentation, and connect with Moonfair's investor solutions team. You can also check out Moonfair's library of white papers exploring different topics around private markets, investing, along with some of Moonfair's favorite episodes of the podcast. So with that, thanks for listening to this episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating and a nice comment. Let other people know about the show too. We'd be really grateful. Also, sign up to become a member at macrohive.com. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.